Hi everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Tina, and I am the Capability Building Coordinator for Connecting Up and TechSoup New Zealand. Connecting Up is a part of the Info Exchange Group. Info Exchange is a not-for-profit social enterprise that has delivered technology for social justice for over 25 years. With over 100 staff across Australia and New Zealand, we tackle the biggest social challenges through the smart and creative use of technology. I'd like to welcome you all to the webinar, How to Become an Inspiring Speaker, which will be presented by Fran Connolly from FC Marketing. We'll start with a little bit of housekeeping. All lines are muted, so if you have any technical issues, please type it into the questions box on your webinar panel, and I'll be able to assist you through there. If you have any questions during the session, please also type it into the questions box, and Fran will answer them in the Q&A section throughout the webinar. Please note that your comments and questions will not appear to the entire group. If you are on a Wi-Fi connection and have multiple programs open, this can sometimes affect the quality of the audio and video of the webinar. If possible, please close all other programs to help you have the best experience. Please note that the webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording and the slides will be sent to you shortly after the webinar ends. Before we start, I'd also like to remind you that there will be a short survey at the end of the webinar. We'd appreciate it if you took a few minutes to provide us with some feedback. That's all from me for now. I'll hand it over to Fran to get things started. Thanks, Fran.
Thank you, Tina, and thank you everyone for tuning in today. It's actually really exciting to be here. We've got people from every state and also people from New Zealand, so a special warm welcome from sunny Sydney. If I can work my webcam, I think, can you see me yet? I think I'm on. Anyway, if I am, a very warm welcome from sunny Sydney. And I live in Abbotsford in Sydney, and the guy mowing the lawn has just stopped, so you can probably hear me more easily. And I'm going to turn the webcam off because apparently that'll slow down the internet connection. So I'll just click the stop button. I think it's going to be off. I don't know. Tina, tell me if it's still on. But anyway, there you go. So thank you for tuning in today. And I'll start by sharing my goal for this webinar, and that's to give you some practical tips and a framework that you can take away and hopefully apply in your organisation tomorrow. So moving on, I'm going to click and hopefully my slide move. Yes, that's me sitting on a park bench in Sutherland. I have a wonderful client down that area in the south of Sydney, and there's a lovely Chinese garden outside a library. So thank you again for tuning in today. So let's get rolling. Why do we present? Is it to convey information? Is it to educate? Is it to inform? Is it to present a slide deck? Getting clear on intent really helps. I like to think that we present to influence thinking and inspire action. And here's a shot of the great Dylan Alcott, who certainly does both. I like this quote from Don Watson, who was Paul Keating's speechwriter. And he says that a great speech should challenge the audience, not just tell them what they're used to hearing. Every great speech should encourage people to think anew. So what makes an inspiring speaker? For me, it's belief, it's passion, and it's concrete language. Over the last 2 years, I've chosen to become a much better speaker, and that's just consciously watching great speakers in action. I love TED Talks, and here are 4 of my favorite speakers. There's Paul Keating from his, I think it was in 1992, the famous Redfern speech, Barack Obama in 2008, Nelson Mandela, and of course, Martin Luther King from '63. If you took one thing away from today's webinar, it's this: be authentic. Share stories and challenge your audience. So that's actually 3 things, but the number 1 thing would be to be you, be authentic. And when I say concrete language, you need to make it tangible for the audience, visual, so that they can see it and feel it, so that they can actually hear your message. So a little bit about me. I'm a facilitator. I run culture building programs for teams, and strategic marketing workshop programs for teams in the not-for-profit sector. This is me running a workshop in Adelaide earlier this year, 8 different organisations. It was a fabulous bunch. I'm also a speaker. I've become a speaker over the last 2 years. A funny thing happens when you become an author. You get invited to speak, but more about that later. Oh, and as I said, I'm an author. This book came out 3 years ago, and this book's coming out in a month's time. It's actually not quite that big. That cover's about 50% larger than it should have been. And that's me looking like the goose that just laid the golden egg with a mock-up of the front cover. Bit more background. My first career was in the Australian toy industry. That's where I really learned how to be a marketer in a highly competitive, highly promotional environment. And over the last 20 years, I've been privileged to work with lots of wonderful organisations in the not-for-profit sector. And since 2008, I've spent most of the time in disability and aged care working with clients. And then, of course, when the book came out, it's been continually working with clients in the disability space, although more and more now I'm getting interest from aged care and mental health providers. But on my first big speaking gig, after my book came out, I totally tanked. That's me at the front of the National Disability Services Conference in February in 2017. So I don't know if you were in the audience, you might remember that I was the speaker who got up on the stage. The speaker before me was running 20 minutes over time, which was stressing me out. I got up on stage, raced up, bumped the lectern, knocked over everything that was on top of it, pens, pads, and then said a very well-known 4-letter word into the mic as my first word, which was a great icebreaker. And then I made the mistake of trying to deliver a 40-minute presentation in 20 minutes. So after that day, I realised I had to quickly study how do great speakers do it? What were the tips? What were the tools? So what I'd like to share with you today is what I've learned over the last 2 years and what I wished I'd known that day. So before we go any further though, why are speaking skills so critical right now for non-profit leaders and managers? Well, there's some obvious answers. First up, this sector needs to become a hell of a lot better at sharing its stories. There are so many frontline heroes in the not-for-profit sector, so many people who are making the world of difference to other people's lives on a daily basis, and we need to tell their stories. We need to be a lot better at that. But secondly, and this is more a timing issue, in the face of 2 royal commissions in Australia at least, and increasingly individualised funding, whether it's mobile packages, whether it's an NDIS funding package, organisational culture has to become the key business driver. Because leaders have to have a hell of a lot more face-to-face in order to protect their culture and preserve it. Culture has to become the key business drivers, and that requires leaders who know how to engage, leaders who know how to motivate, leaders who know how to inspire. It requires leaders who are prepared to be authentic. Because unfortunately, if I don't believe in you, I'm not going to believe in your leadership. I'm not going to believe in what you're saying, and I'm not convinced that you're actually true to your mission. Now, that sounds like heavy stuff. And unfortunately it is. The other reason speaking skills are so critical is because we need to hang on to our great leaders. We need to hang on to our great CEOs and managers and build more. In times of massive change, in the perfect storm that's happening right now across the entire community care sector in Australia, and I don't know as much about New Zealand, but I suspect similar trends there. In times of massive change, leaders actually need more face-to-face with their teams and stakeholders, not less, because you need to bring people with you on the journey. I personally know an amazing CEO who who I've worked with, who was driving a very strong change agenda across his organisation because he had to in the face of the NDIS. He was much loved and respected by his employees. He built a very strong leadership team. They were an award-winning organisation. But he failed to retain the support of his board and lost his role. So the message is we have to bring people with us on this journey. That requires speaking skills. In times of massive change, I believe that great leaders do two things really well, and both require speaking skills. Number one, they know how to share great stories that inspire trust. And number two, they know how to connect their mission to the change process so that people don't feel you've lost touch with your cause. Because the minute people feel that there's mission drift, they're less likely to trust you. They're not going to be sure that you are actually a values-driven organisation. So we need to be able to connect the mission of the organisation to the change process. The other reason, and I'll come to it later, is that the mission and your history, how you began, what brought you here, how you continue to be relevant, that's what stays the same in the midst of it, when everything else is changing. Those underpinning values, they're like a rock that protects you in times of change. So in today's webinar, what we're going to be covering is just, it's such a big topic. And I thought, how do I really summarize what I've learned over the last 2 years so that you can take it away in the next 45 minutes that we're spending together and apply it. So I've broken it into 3 simple sections. Firstly, we'll look at managing your nerves. Secondly, we'll look at what's a framework, what's the structure that you can apply to any presentation, whether it's to your board, whether it's to your team meeting, whether it's to your senior leadership team or your broader community. We need a scalable framework that actually connects you with your audience. And finally, what are the stories you need to tell? And how do you tell them? How do you tell them so that they believe they're credible and they're memorable? Now, I've actually paused here for questions just in case I've rushed my intro and anyone has any questions. Tina, are you cool for me to go on, or shall we take a break?
Just one question. Are you going to be preparing presentation slides?
Oh, look, great. Thank you. I'm actually not, because we've only got a limited amount of time, and I think there's often too much of a focus on slides rather than content and connection. But if anyone does want like a little mini cheat sheet of the do's and don'ts of slides, just send me an email and I can pull one together. And I think, as I said before, this is such a big topic that I've really tried to condense it into manageable chunks for this particular webinar. Okay, so I might go on. Managing your nerves. In the research for the webinar, I discovered that 75% of people suffer from speech anxiety, which is also called glossophobia. I learned a lot doing this webinar. And the reason that spider is there is that a fear of public speaking is more common than fear of spiders. I don't know that I would agree with that, but anyway, that looks pretty scary. And I think the main message around this point is that nerves aren't the enemy. They just show that you really care. So how do you manage nerves? Well, to summarize, be organized. I'm not going to spend the time going through each of the 8 bullets here, but I think if I had to pull some main ones out, it's absolutely spend time with your audience. And if, like me, you're speaking into a little black box right now, have a photo of a typical audience member. I've got a photo of a client in front of me. Her name is Nicola. We get on like a house on fire, and I love working with her. She's the CEO of a disability organisation here in Sydney. So I'm I've prepared content that I think would be of practical value to Nicola now. I don't even know if she's on the line. There's also Mel in South Australia. I could name any number of clients. So have someone in your mind that you're talking to and make sure you know their issues and ensure your content is relevant. Check your timing and practice. There's a great saying, I thought I had it on a slide, but I can't see it here. Less content, more structure. And that was a real great early learning for me. Someone said to me, you're so obsessed with getting your content out, but we want to know about you, Fran, very early on 2 years ago. And that was a real surprise because I thought I kept having to load up my content to prove that I knew enough about the topic. This isn't about proving anything. It's about being heard and understood. So next key point here is never, never rely on technology. 90% of the presentations that I attend, and I attend a lot, the technology fails. The laptop fails. The slides don't work. People are stuck. I was at an AGM last night. A chair was presenting and his slides didn't work. It's no surprise, but always have a fallback plan. And he recovered fabulously. But have a fallback plan and doubles of everything. And I think the other one I want to point out here is if you are speaking to a large audience, before you start, pause. I'm thinking of one particular CEO, and every time he gets up, it's like you're chasing a freight train. He speaks so fast, but he is so across his topic. But what he does, by speaking too fast and not pausing even before he commences, he appears excessively nervous and he undermines his own credibility. So yeah, pause. The next, how do you manage nerves? This is a big one for me. And what really shifted it for me is that this actually isn't about me. Today's webinar isn't about me. It's about how I can possibly give you something that you can take away and apply tomorrow. So I'm here to serve. And it really flips it, because then the focus isn't on me and what I look like, what my hair looks like, if I bump the lectern, it doesn't matter. Another great tip is don't aim to impress. If you can, aim to inspire. Talk to them, not at them. And as a marketer, this last one's a biggie. Remember that everything you say, how you look, how punctual you are, how you're dressed, everything sends a message, and you are a living, breathing representative of your brand. And here's the trick. If you believe in the organization's values that underpin your organization's brand, then it's a natural alignment. All you have to do when you get up on stage is speak your truth. That may sound corny, it may sound woo-woo. I don't care. I firmly believe that if you speak from your heart, you're going to get a lot more connection than if you speak from your head. People will remember what you say. So be clear on why you're speaking. Second step is use a structure. Use the right framework. Reading overloaded slides creates zero engagement and serves nobody. None of us have time to sit through PowerPoint. It is such an overutilized, over-relied on resource. None of my workshops have PowerPoint. I'm a flip chart girl. Obviously, for a webinar, we need PowerPoint. But if you have to have PowerPoint, use visuals, don't use loads of text. And this is a really interesting stat. I was doing some research just yesterday on the average attention span of people. Here we have a goldfish. Back in 2000, the average attention span of a goldfish was 9 seconds. Today, not surprisingly, it's still about the same because goldfish don't have mobile phones, they can't get on Instagram, they don't have laptops. However, in 2000, the average attention span of a man, and this is a guy I got from a free stock image, it's no one in particular, so I'm not defaming anybody, was 20 seconds. Today, ladies and gentlemen, it's less than a goldfish, because this guy might be right now sitting on this webinar, he's probably scrolling through his emails, checking his phone, he's got his Instagram open. 3 to 5 seconds, that's all you've got. You've got to grab attention. Why? Because more than ever, and this is a great quote from Donald Miller. Donald Miller, I'm interrupting myself here to pick up a book, which is somewhere on the floor on the other side. He wrote this brilliant book called Building a Story Brand, which is my current favourite marketing book. But he says our brains are constantly scanning the environment for information that is going to help meet their need to survive. It's a scientific need to survive. So if we blast a bunch of noise at our brains, they're going to just ignore us. So frameworks help the brain absorb information. And that means, as I said earlier, less content, more structure. So our brain can go, ah. I'd like to share with you today what I've proven to be a powerful framework that I think works for any presentation. It's not mine. It's one that was developed by a colleague of mine, Andrew Griffiths, and he's kindly allowed me to share it with you today. Andrew was a brilliant public speaker, and I've learned a lot from him. And I'll take you through these 9 steps. And you might think this is way too complex for a team meeting, but this can be tailored, and the brain loves this. So to begin with, the aspirational opening. Step 1, give people a reason to listen to your topic. Why is this so important, and why is this so important now? Now steps 2, 3, and 4, give them a reason to trust you. Why should they listen to you on this topic? Step 5, this is where you explain how the rest of the presentation will work. What are the steps? And the brain will go, ah, my goodness, thank God, she's got a structure here. Now, step 6, that's when we get into the key messages. And you only need 3 or 4. You don't need 12. You don't need a PowerPoint slide with 50 points on it. I attended a presentation last week. It was in the evening, and it was a culture expert presenting, and the slides were extremely text heavy, and it was a surprise, and I probably should move on. Anyway, after you presented your key messages, this is the bulk of the presentation. This should take about 60% of the time. 7, regroup and repeat what you've just told them, just the key bullet points. And the brain will at last go, I can rest again. We've just done this heavy duty stuff. Now I can relax, and yep, that's what I learned. Now, step 8, challenge them so that there is absolutely no question in the audience's mind what action you want them to take. Make it crystal clear. After they leave here today, what you expect of them. And 9 is the aspirational close. 9 is where you give them the reason to take that action, and you loop back to step 1. Refer back to why this topic is important, and you close cleanly. So this framework will be in the slides that you'll get from today. It'll be in the recordings. I did possibly gloss over this bit a little when I said give them a reason to talk about you, where you are now, how you got there, what your journey was, what makes you credible, and why this topic matters to you. Why are you sharing this today? That establishes trust. And if you don't have trust, you don't have anyone listening. So why does it work? Well, this is just my take on it. That's my little cartoon. I hope you like it. Well, because you take them on a journey. You are authentic, you are engaging, you respected where they were at in that journey at each of those touch points, and as a result, you made it easy for them to absorb your content. This makes sense. So why does it work? Because the brain loves it. You met them at their level, as I said, and you established trust. You shared why the topic matters and why they should trust you before you jumped in with your messages or what you wanted them to do. You distilled the content to 3 key messages, not 6 or 12. If you've got 6 or 12 messages, think again. You probably don't. And then you regrouped just to check all the ducks were aligned, and you made it clear about the call to action, and you closed cleanly. I may have raced through that too quickly, but are there any questions at this stage, Tina?
Yes, we do have a question, Fran. Caroline has asked, can you give a little bit more detail on speak to them and not at them? Just an example or two, please.
Yeah, great question, Caroline. I don't know if you've ever heard a phrase called speaking into the listening. I picked this up at a personal development course I did some time ago. There's absolutely no point speaking if you don't have people listening. And you can't get them listening until you establish why they should listen to you up front. So it's important. If you're just downloading content, you're just speaking at them. And whether they're listening or not, they might be like that audience shot I showed you, just glazed eyes. But if you're speaking to them, that means that you've got their attention. And I sometimes say to my husband, don't you know that I wasn't listening? So why are you talking? Which isn't very friendly of me. But there's absolutely no point talking if you know that nobody's listening. And is that sort of a circular argument? I don't know whether I've answered that question well enough.
Okay, some more questions have come through. So, Caroline, if there's more to that you wanted to add, please feel free to put it in the questions box. So Layla has said, step 5, can you please provide more information? Is it the journey of the presentation or the journey of the organization?
Great question, Layla. And it depends on your topic. Every presentation is a journey with a beginning and an end, an open and a close. Now, you might be talking about the journey of the organisation, and I suggest that was the example that I used, that the organisation has a history. It's connected to that history through its mission. It's connected to its future through its mission. It's connected to each other through its mission. So that's the journey of the organisation. And I guess the bottom line for me is that the mission is this fundamental cultural cornerstone that if a leader can keep reflecting back, you can keep the organisation connected, whether it's through awards, whether it's through values that come out of the mission, whether it's retelling your origin story. So there's 2 very separate journeys. But for me, every presentation has a journey and every organisation has a journey. But whether they're the same thing depends on what your topic is.
Thanks, Fran. Next one is Simon here in Adelaide. Fran, how do you approach speaking engagements such as this where the audience can't see you or provide any visual cues to you versus speaking to a group in person?
Oh, Simon, great question. Look, you'd laugh because I get more freaked out with webinars than I do speaking to 500 people because I can't see heads nodding or faces smiling. I don't get those visual approval cues. It's like I was up on stage in Brisbane once and there were lights in my eyes and I couldn't see anybody. So what I do is I've got a photo of Nicola here that I'm looking at. In fact, I could probably, no, I won't show you Nicola's photo because she may not like it. What else do I do? Oh, I've got Emma. I could show you Emma. No, she's not. Emma is my right-hand woman who attends all my workshops with me. She's my co-facilitator. She keeps me on track with timing. She gives me the thumbs up if I'm saying something that's okay. It's a great question and it's really tough for me, Simon. But I've got to say of all the speaking modes, webinar's the toughest. So hopefully there's something practical there for you, but it's one that I'd love to get better at. And I hope to do lots of free webinars next year. Thank you for the question.
Thanks, Fran. Next one is from Steve. I'm giving a talk to some politicians. How critical of their behavior can I be without losing them?
Oh, whoa, Steve. I'm not a political girl, and I really am. It scares the hell out of me. It depends on the context, and it depends on who else is there and the degree of confidentiality. And I would say it's about the meeting before the meeting. It's the presentation before the presentation. It's what conversations you have with them before you're in, before you're in that situation.
And oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go on.
Sorry, I was going to say we had an email through with a question as well. Cass has asked, how can I build trust if I'm not high up in the organization or an expert on the topic?
How do you build trust if you're not high? You don't have to be high up in an organization to build trust. You don't have to be an expert on a specific topic to build trust, but you do have to be authentic. You do have to walk your talk. You do have to live your values. If you say you'll do something, you'll do something. If you're punctual, funnily enough, that really builds trust. It's about being respectful of where other people are coming from, and it's about framing what you're saying, having permission before you go to the next step. Framing conversations is a really important skill. When I'm running a workshop, for example, I'll have a set of agreements that we'll all agree to before the workshop commences. And that allows them to trust me because they know that I'll go so far and no further. But really, it's about how well you listen to other people. And I often say that people won't trust you until they know they've been heard. I don't know if that'll help, but I hope it will.
Thanks, Fran. We do have a few more questions that have come through, but I'll save them for the next Q&A section.
Okay, thank you, Tina. So this is where the magic happens. When you begin to share your stories, we all have stories. And if you can share them in the first person, it's so much more powerful. Stories about individuals, not stories about hundreds of people you've helped, but the stories about a one. I often say that we human beings are hardwired to sit up and listen to stories about an individual. Whoops, here we are. It's the stories that make your message memorable. And it's stories that'll make that framework scalable. When I say scalable, I mean, you know those 8 points that I showed you earlier? Depending on whether you've got a 10-minute presentation or a 1-hour gig, you can enlarge that with stories. Stories is when the brain goes, yes, I can relax, I can absorb. So even if all you did was become great at telling stories, that would be a winning presentation. One of the great tips that I tell my clients in our culture workshop is that if you can start every team meeting with someone going around the room just sharing a value story from the week that's just gone, or if you nominated one person to come with a story for the following week. DuPont, Emma, my colleague, used to work with DuPont, and they had to start every meeting with a safety story because the one value that drove the entire organization was safety. And people would bring those stories to the team meeting. Now, what that does is not just start to bring the mission alive, it actually changes the energy in the room. People, it's like their brains will switch off from that device and they'll start to, it brings the brain into the room, if that makes sense. Another great icebreaker that I use in my workshops, and you're welcome to use it, is share one thing that nobody else knows about you in the room. And we just go around the room. We've had Buddhist monks, We've had someone whose pets had 1 million fans on Instagram, a pair of poodles. We've had another guy who was offered 10,000 camels for his wife. And suddenly what happens is that small gathering, even if it's only 3 or 4 people, by sharing stories, they become connected. They become more like a team. Anyway, I'm starting to rave. The 3 rules of great storytelling. Now, if you're in Victoria, you'll probably recognise that this is a Collingwood football club shop. And I'm telling you this story because I recently attended a presentation. And if I could have videoed the guy, it would have been a classic way to give you an example of common speaking mistakes. He continued to use stories, for example, of the Collingwood Football Club to a room of about 20 women who were in New South Wales. And we didn't know the Collingwood anecdotes, and nor did they sort of break the ice or connect with us. So the 3 rules for me of great storytelling are: make sure your stories are relevant to your audience. Follow a structure. There is a structure for how to tell a great story. If you don't have one, send me an email and I'll send it to you. And thirdly, add visuals. If you don't have an overhead or a PowerPoint, that's fine. Create a visual image with your story. This poor guy, we've got enough time. Just give you a bit of background. He was expecting about 200 people to the presentation, and there were only about 20 to 30. So I'll just run through the things that went wrong, and I'm hoping that he's not on the line. I don't think he is. Anyway, he's a CEO of a very large non-profit provider, not in disability. He was expecting about 200 people. Only 20 turned up. So he made the 20 wait. And we waited about 15 minutes and still nobody else turned up. So always start on time. Secondly, we were sitting in the room, 20 of us, and there was no warmth, no connection, no effort to try and get to know anyone before the presentation started. Thirdly, there wasn't any humour in the presentation, so it was a little hard to warm to the guy. Fourthly, there was no perceived structure to his presentation. He was overloaded with very content-heavy PowerPoint slides, and then the technology failed, and he was lost for another 10 minutes. And as a result, when I left the room after the presentation was scheduled to end, he was still going, and I think he was going to go for another 10 minutes. So I'm being really cruel here, but you don't know who he is, and it's a great example of common mistakes, with apologies to Collingwood. Whoops. Now, Fighting Chance is a fantastic little non-profit, or they're not little, non-profit organisation in Sydney. They help young adults with intellectual disabilities, specifically around employment. They have an amazing culture. I interviewed Laura for my new book. And when I asked her about the significance of the origin story, if you're listening, you may call that a mission story, but I call it an origin story. I said, what's the significance of that to your culture? I was trying to get at what's the significance, how important is storytelling? And she just came out and said, the origin story is our culture. Storytelling is the most important tool in our armory. We also empower others to tell their story. And for example, why did they say yes to working with us? What was really interesting, I interviewed about 13 people for this book, and 2 or 3 of them said exactly this. Not only did we tell our potential new recruits our story, but we asked for theirs. Now, in each of those cases, those organisations had stellar high-performance cultures. They had no trouble recruiting staff. They are a standout. So that's just a little tip. Conversely, I was working with a statewide non-profit a year or 2 ago, and as part of my customised culture program, which is called Bring the Brand Alive, I interview everyone before they're in the room. So there were 22 members of the senior leadership team. Only 2 of those managers could tell me the mission story with any passion, with any connection, with any excitement about how relevant that mission still was for that organisation today. So for me, 20 people had a mission statement, 2 managers were on a mission. So the message is, if you don't have a story, a mission story, you have a narrative vacuum. And in the absence of a story, that just means people create their own stories. And people start to disconnect and you start to get culture stress. I have a marketer's approach to culture and to building high performance cultures. And it's about getting into the hearts and minds in an authentic manner of each of the team members, as if you're looking at it from an employee's experience. So as another example of having the right communication piece, and hopefully you can't hear the guy on the lawnmower outside my window. I was recently working with an organisation who had to let a member of the senior leadership team go because they were clearly not performing. But the CEO didn't make a statement. The CEO didn't come out and say anything, nor was there a farewell gathering. Another point, how you welcome and exit people from your organisation is a communication opportunity, and it goes directly to the strength of your culture. So what happened was that this senior leadership team member left. She told her version of events to all her team, who, as a result, this whole new culture of silo developed around her team. And I think the message is, if in the absence of the leader or the manager coming forward and explaining the story, why that happened, there's a communication gap. And if you leave a communication gap, people make up their own story, because we are meaning-making machines. We seek meaning. So I'll keep going. So for me, stories are the ultimate sense-making mechanism. And the stories that you need to tell, well, for most nonprofits, I think there's 3 really clear categories. You've got to tell that origin story. If you feel you've got a culture issue, if you just focused on the origin story, you would be 30% of the way there to turning it around. Secondly, the CEO story. If you're a CEO and you're on this call, do your team know why you do what you do? Do your team know what you did before? People need a reason to trust you. And often the CEO story, if you see people interviewed in the paper, they do that really cleverly, because they turn it into the CEO story, then talks about the organisation story. And it's a great segue into selling the organisation. The third category is the values in action stories, or I call them brand stories. These are stories that demonstrate evidence that you are actually living your values, and they're told in the first person. So for an employee, perhaps the single most important story right now, particularly, I keep talking about disability, but this would apply to any of the caring professions, is why I love my job. And put that story on Instagram, and then you'll start to attract more recruits. They talk about why they love coming to work, particularly millennials. I just was on LinkedIn this morning, and Marathon Health, a client of mine posted this great it was a 2-line story with a photograph on LinkedIn about a new OT and what she's doing and why she loves it. And they operate in central New South Wales. They do a fantastic job. They've got their own plane because they need it. Anyway, I won't go on about Marathon Health, but it's as simple as that. It doesn't have to cost a lot of money. So the rest of the slide can be read there. What I've covered today, and I know it seems like it's been, there's a lot in a small amount of time, but the 3 key messages that I hope I've helped you with today is, number 1 is how to manage your nerves. Number 2 is how to structure your presentation and why the brain loves it. And number 3, how to share the right stories. And For me, they're the 3 key essentials to a great presentation. So my challenge, if I follow my own framework, my challenge to you is to please try any of these tips in the next 30 days and see the difference it makes to the outcomes of your speaking, whether it's with a small team, whether it's across the organisation. And I'd love to hear how you go. And tailor it for you so it feels authentic, because it's more about whether you're being true to you in presenting this content. That's what's going to give you the credibility you need. So a final request before we go to questions is, as a sector, we have to share more stories. When you tune out today, I'd like you to share stories of the organisation's actual impact, whether it's in your local community, because whether you're in disability, aged care, mental health, nursing, health, these are all local businesses, even if you're a national organisation, because families don't want to travel. So you need to operate as if you've got 90 outlets across Australia, you need to operate as if you have 90 small businesses serving 90 communities. And we want stories of local impact. And the reason we need to share more stories is because when you commit, if you really commit to becoming an inspiring speaker and you're a non-profit leader, what you're actually committing to is being a champion for your mission in your community. Oh, and here's the plug. My book will be available in a month's time. You can pre-order it now from your website. The reason I'd love to get this book out there is because there are 13 fabulous interviews and case studies of CEOs around Australia who shared so generously, and I've packed it around my methodology for building a high-performance culture. It's a marketer's methodology, and there's a workbook as well if you want some practical tools to apply it. If you're interested in a one-day culture masterclass, I love running this program. Even Emma and I do it. It's basically a train the trainer. We give you all the content you need to implement a culture program in-house. We only need 12 people to run it. It's deliberately affordable. It's a lot more affordable than my customized 6-week program. It's one day. And the reason we've done that, the reason I've cannibalized my own product is because I want to get the content out there. So are there any questions about any of that? I might have raced through the ending a little. Tina?
Thanks, Fran. So Layla has asked, are there any tips for building best structure of information?
Okay, Layla, that's best structure of information. I'm afraid that's a bit vague for me. As a marketer, my first question is, who is your audience? Second question is, what are their problems? What are their frustrations? And third would be, once you can answer those 2 questions, you have to frame your message in terms of their problems. Hope that helps.
Okay. Does this framework work for a board presentation?
Absolutely. You just have to tailor it. You cut it down. You would shorten where you've come from, but absolutely put that in. They need to believe you. They need to know why they can trust you. So the steps are, why does this topic matter now, basically. Then the next one is, why should I trust you about the topic? Then the next one, just keep going through that journey. But if you follow those steps, then you've got them with you on that journey, and every presentation is a journey.
What if I can't reduce my presentation to 3 key messages?
Great question. I'm saying you haven't distilled it enough. Think about your audience and what they're ready to receive, where they're at, because they may not need the advanced version, or they may need the super advanced version, or they may need the elementary version. And the only way to know how to tailor it is to talk to them beforehand, understand their issues, and understand how they articulate them. Because we haven't even spoken about language. But hopefully that answers your question.
Yep. And the next one is, if you had one standout speaking tip, what would it be?
I think it's be authentic. Yep.
Okay. Thank you, Fran. And just the comment here from Steve. Great info here. You've helped me structure my approach and my presentations. Thanks so much.
Oh, my pleasure, Steve. And I'd love to hear how you go.
And was there anything you wanted to add, Fran, before we wrap up?
That's a thank you. They're my contact details. And thank you for whether you're listening live or listening to the recording. Please sing out if I can help in any way, and really appreciate how many people sign up for this webinar, and I really hope that this stuff adds value. Let me know how you go.
Thanks, Fran. One question has just come through. Fran, what's your take on distributing presentation materials after the presentation? That one's from Simon.
Fine, just don't do it before. I think if the minute you give someone something to read, you've lost them. Do it after the presentation. And in fact, up front, tell them you're going to be doing that so that they'll actually be listening to you, not taking notes.
Which is exactly what we do here at Connecting Up. Thanks, Fran. So
Thank
you so much. Thank you so much for presenting today, Fran, and thank you everyone for joining us. I hope you've all learned a lot from this presentation and that your questions have been answered. If you do have any other questions that come to mind later on or any feedback at all, please send that through to events@connectingup.org and we can answer that offline. You can also contact Fran directly via the information on your screen. You've got her mobile number and email address there, so please feel free to reach out. Don't forget that the recording will be available on our website very shortly and a link will be sent to you, so keep an eye out on your inbox. Again, thank you for being with us. Enjoy the rest of your day and we look forward to seeing you all next time. Thanks, Fran. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Tina. Thanks, everyone.